long as that's on, it should be good. There you go.
Is that better? Yeah, that's better. So focusing first on their biogeography. So it's gonna be bad. I'm gonna have to stand still. Okay, so who knows what biogeography means? Who has a guess what biogeography means? Right. It's the distributional pattern of taxa and why they're found where they are. So you can imagine that animals like squirrels will be limited in where they can be due to mountain ranges, or if they're on an island, it may be difficult to get off the island. But for fishes, they're really stuck in stream or lake or ocean habitat, right? So the connections between these aquatic habitats, we tend to think of like on our lifetime, are pretty permanent, but over time, these connections are created and lost. And so often for fish biogeography, someone who's interested in fish biogeography, you kind of have to piece together a little puzzle looking at where some of these connections may have been created and then subsequently lost. So just a brief outline of what I'm going to go over is I'm going to focus on the eastern and western slope of the Sierra Nevada mountains, focusing on high elevation trout. And then I'm going to focus on some of the lakes in the higher Sierras, looking at frogs and interactions with fish and birds and interactions with fish. And then if I can get to it, I'm going to focus on Chinook salmon and talk about some of the management concerns related to some of the different subspecies of salmon we have in California. So learning objectives will be to describe some of the different species of fishes in the high Sierras, understand factors that influence their distribution or biogeography, why they are where they are, identify some major threats affecting their population, describe how non-native trout affect these lake ecosystems in the high Sierras, determine linkages between aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems in those lakes, and describe the life history and threats to winter run Chinook salmon. So water in California is organized primarily into 6 different basins, and this is largely due to drainage patterns. So you can see that the Central Valley here, the large blue polygon, all the water there that is in that basin flows out of the bay, right, in San Francisco. So they're basically organized by connections between these different waterways. And today I'm going to focus on the Central Valley, which has, because it's so large and has limited connections to other adjacent watersheds, there's a lot of endemic species in this region. So who knows what an endemic species is? Yes, you can just yell it out. Exactly, yep. It's a species that's only found in that one location. So transitioning now to the eastern Sierra Nevada mountains, there are about 12 species of fishes found there. Some of these include non-game fishes like the Tahoe sucker, Paiute sculpin, mountain whitefish, the tui chub, the Lahontan redside. Really great fishes. Also, the Lahontan cutthroat trout is found in the eastern Sierras. But it's relatively low species diversity, okay? Only 12 species across that whole mountain range on the eastern Sierras. When looking at the western Sierras, there are 22 species, and 14 of those are common above 500 feet. So now we're starting to get into some of these fishes that are common at higher elevations, okay? All of these species are endemic, and there are 4 runs of Chinook salmon, so 5 anadromous populations of fishes. Does anyone know what anadromous means? A salmon is anadromous. A sturgeon is anadromous. Yes. They do swim upstream. Yep. Okay. But anything else? Yes.
They're born in fresh water, migrate to the sea, and then come back to fresh water.
Yes, absolutely. Perfect. So they're born in fresh water. They migrate to the ocean where they can grow large, and then they swim upstream, like you mentioned, back to spawn. And after they spawn, they die. So across these 2 different sides of the same mountain range, there's only one species that is found in both. And that's this small minnow, the speckled dace. So I want you to just take a minute and think about the geography of the Sierra Mountains. Why are there drastic differences? Okay, there's almost twice as many species on the western slope of the Sierras as there is on the eastern slope. So just take maybe a minute. You can discuss if you'd like, and then I'll have you tell me what you think. Okay, who has an idea they're willing to share? Yes. So allopatric speciation, absolutely. That's how those species are getting there to begin with, is that they're moving into areas and then becoming isolated, right? And that has to do with, in fishes, that's really common because drainages are created and lost, like when we're talking about deep time, right? I heard like geologic time. Drainages are created and lost, so that's how some of these endemic species get to where they are. But it's not exactly what I'm looking for, but that was good, yes.
I've been informed by my betters that the answer is always the rain shadow.
The rain shadow. That's actually interesting. It's a great guess, and it definitely would lead to there being more water on the western side than on the eastern side, but it's not exactly what I'm looking for. But that's amazing, actually. I hadn't thought about that. Something that happened in North America, well, what we think of as a long time ago. Glaciation. Someone said it. I heard someone say ice, I thought too, but maybe not. Okay, so the glaciation of the Sierra Nevada mountains, this region right here shown in kind of white, the white polygon would have been glaciation, I mean, even 15,000 years ago, which isn't really that long ago, which would have limited the movements of fish to some of these higher elevation locations. And when we look at areas that don't have fish, so the historically fishless regions of the Sierra Nevada mountains, and then look at, on the right, we can see the maximum extent of glaciation in the Sierras. They look like they overlap pretty well, right? So this would have prevented fish from moving into higher elevation lakes and then transitioning over, if they could, right? Because the height of land can prevent fish movement as well, which water flows downstream, so fishes swimming over would have had to utilize some sort of temporary stream to make it to the other side. But it's thought that glaciation has prevented species from moving back and forth and also prevented fishes from occupying a lot of these high alpine lakes. However, outside of the range of glaciation, the California golden trout complex is multiple species that have evolved in a relatively small area, and it's actually the California state fish is the California golden trout. So there's 3 species of what's considered golden trout. There's the California golden trout, the state fish, the little Kern golden trout, and the Kern River rainbow trout. So these are all descendants of rainbow trout, related subspecies of rainbow trout. They're found in the southern Sierras, as I showed you on the previous figure, just south of the maximum extent of glaciation. So these fish are relatively isolated to this area, small region, and they're federally threatened. The state of the salmonids lists them as a species of high concern, high, critical for the 3 species in there. Okay, so these native endemic species in California are under threat, right? Their populations aren't doing well. And another trout that I'm going to focus on briefly is the Lahontan cutthroat trout that's actually found in the eastern Sierras. Okay, this is a sister group, so very closely related to rainbow trout. But this specific subspecies of cutthroat trout is found in lakes, in streams, in the eastern Sierras. They're highly tolerable of alkaline or really high pH water, and also really tolerant of water that has a lot of suspended solids. So when there's a lot of mud in the stream, it can reduce fish's ability to breathe. It can clog their gills. This particular subspecies is pretty tolerant to that. But again, it's ESA listed and a species of high concern. So their populations are threatened, or they're threatened with extinction, and they've been extirpated from large portions of their range.
Dr. Alba, when you say ESA, what are you referring to there?
Yes, thank you. So in California is actually lucky enough because it does have its own species protection. But the federal government lists species of special concern via the ESA. So they can be threatened or they can be endangered, and it provides particular protections for those species. California actually has their own listing as well. So they can list animals as being threatened or endangered outside of the federal government. The ESA is the Endangered Species Act. Great. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask, because I'd rather discuss than yes. That's a great question. Very, very good question. They would have all derived from a single branch because they're all more closely related to one another than they are to rainbow trout. So there would have been a rainbow trout population that became isolated, and then, as you mentioned, there's allopatric speciation and specification to that area that they're occupying, and they would have continued to develop traits that differ from the rainbow trout. Great question. And the same thing is true for cutthroat trout. They think that there was a single lineage of rainbow trout, because they're sister taxa, very closely related, that diverged from rainbow trout, and now there's, it's always in debate whether there's 7 or up to 14 different subspecies of cutthroat trout. Okay, so one more fish I'm going to talk about is the Paiute cutthroat trout, which is the rarest trout in North America. It's native to only one drainage here in California, that's Silver King Creek. And apparently, and when you're a fish biologist, you hear a lot of, fishing stories, right? And so apparently, in 1912, a sheep herder transplanted some of these fish upstream of a waterfall, which turns out to be the only thing that prevented them from becoming extirpated completely or extinct. And that's because cutthroat trout can hybridize with rainbow trout because they're so closely related, and they can produce viable offspring, or offspring that can also produce offspring. So again, very isolated endemic species, federally threatened under the Endangered Species Act. The state of the salmonids, obviously they're of high concern if they're in a single drainage. But it sort of begs the question then, we have these amazing endemic populations that historically were isolated That's how they became different species, right? And unique populations. They're tolerant and evolved to high altitude conditions, yet they're endangered or threatened under the Endangered Species Act. So what makes these fish vulnerable to extinction? And maybe a better way to word that is, what are some of the threats that you can think of that exist for some of these populations? So just take a minute and you can discuss, or you can think about it, and then we'll see what you come up with. I just don't want to be like, whoa, like all of a sudden so loud. I did that at a conference once. Oh, yeah. I know. Set myself up to fail. Oh, that is better. Thank you. I think it will be. Yes.
Is it feasible to catch and eat any?
Not currently, no. Not once they're listed. It's probably even limited to catch them. I think that you can catch golden trout and Lahontan cutthroat trout. I know you can go fishing for them, but probably not the Paiute cutthroat trout.
Watching it now, don't go after them.
But historically, people would have, for sure. For sure. Okay, who has an idea? Or a guess, even? Yes. Loss of habitat. That's yes. Whenever you're talking about animal populations, that's the best guess. And yes, the loss of habitat has had detrimental effects on all of these fishes. Who else has a guess? Yes.
You mentioned that like one of them almost went extinct due to like loss of distinctness through hybridization. Are they all like relatively recent species?
Yes. Yes. So hybridization. Yes. Absolutely. Yes. Dams. Yes. Absolutely. So, anyone else have something before I move on? Yes.
Maybe water pollution.
Water pollution. Yeah. So all of these things, everything that you all mentioned, absolutely have a detrimental effect on their populations. But surprisingly, these other trout are the biggest threat to native salmonids in California. So these three species are the most common trout that you'll find just about anywhere in North America because they're widely stocked for recreational fishing. So this one right here is the rainbow trout, which is actually native to California, but it's often taken outside of its native range and stocked for fishing opportunities. The fish on the top right is a brook trout. They're native to the Appalachian range in North America and found into Canada, and they have been stocked everywhere, and they are very hardy fish. They're very hard to get rid of once they're in there. And then the bottom picture is a brown trout, which is native to Western Europe, northwestern Europe, so Scandinavia, and even into Russia, all the way down to North Africa. So each of these species is now found outside their native range in California, okay? So they've been introduced into habitats where we have these awesome endemic species. What's the consequence of this? So how can non-native trout, what's the mechanism through which they affect native fish? Yes.
They outcompete native fish for resources.
Yes, awesome. Yes. What else? Absolutely, yes, for sure. What else? I actually think that across the two questions you hit all three things that I want to talk about. So good work. Predation. Like you mentioned, brown trout can be highly piscivorous or fish-eating. So trout are predators, and they typically eat small invertebrates that are carried downstream in the water column. But as they grow larger, their metabolism requires them to seek out larger prey. So they become predatory, begin to feed on particularly juveniles from, and they'll eat juvenile brown trout as well, but they'll prey on native salmonid species. Competition was also mentioned, right? So brown trout particularly, they spawn or reproduce in the fall, and native trout species spawn and reproduce in the spring. So but then the eggs hatch around the same time. It's not exactly overlap. But because the brown trout eggs incubate longer, they're larger when they emerge from the gravel. And so in trout, size is the most important predictor of competitive advantage. And introgression, which you mentioned, right? So hybridization, back crossing. So when you have two closely related species that can produce viable offspring, introgression occurs when those offspring then mate with other introgressed individuals. So it begins to dilute the genetics of that native population, because with every generation you're getting less and less and less of that, golden trout or Lahontan cutthroat trout genome being transferred. So how did non-native fishes get here? Yeah, we're always to blame, aren't we? People, right? So, and this began a long, long time ago. People were translocating fishes for food, for sport fishing, particularly sport fishing. A lot of these species are highly prized by anglers, and so they've been, people literally put them on their backs and carried them all over. And what's even more impressive is that they've been stocked into high alpine lakes that were previously inaccessible, right? Just by dropping them out of planes into the lake. Now, of course, all the fish don't survive, but some of them do. It's pretty impressive. And due to glaciation, a lot of the mountain lakes that are found in the Sierras were fishless. Okay, fish never made their way up into these mountain lakes. So here's a map of the Humphreys Basin, French Canyon, and this is in the Sierras. It's basically northeast of Fresno. And you can see that there were no fish in these lakes. But after we started dropping them out of planes, they're ubiquitous, or they're found in almost all the lakes, right? So how might these non-native fish influence the ecosystems that evolved? Well, the ecosystems didn't evolve, but the organisms evolved within the ecosystems with fish absent. How might fish affect the ecosystem? So just take a brief minute and come up with some ideas. Okay, so what might be some of the consequences of non-native trout in high mountain lakes? Yes? Yeah, it could be. Yeah, you could attract like raptors or things like that. But yeah, that's possible. Who else has an idea? Yes. Right. Yep, exactly. So you've introduced prey for other predators, which could change their behavior, right? And then you've introduced a predator that can prey on amphibians and invertebrates, insects, things like that. And that's actually the case, right? Is because of the extent of glaciation, these wonderful little frogs, the yellow-legged frogs, were found throughout all of these previously fishless lakes, right? And there's a great quote from John Muir: "Of course, fishes cannot get to them, and this is generally true of nearly every glacier lake in the range, but they are well stocked with happy frogs," right? And the yellow-legged frog it's a great frog. But yes, fish eat frogs. I heard someone say that. So, and there's multiple pathways through which fish can have negative effects on frogs. Okay, so in ecology, we tend to think about things from like a direct effect or an indirect effect. So direct effect would be predation directly on the frogs or on the tadpoles, potentially even on the egg masses. Indirect effects would reduce the quality of food availability, or it could even it'd just be as small as changing their behavior because they haven't evolved alongside a predator. So, in these ecosystems, this is what's called a food web, right, or a food chain. This is typically, it's a simplified food chain, but this is typically what was thought. Okay, you have mosquito larvae, which are predated on by diving beetles or diaticid beetles, and then the diaticids are then prey to the tadpoles and the adult frogs. So when a predator is introduced, the trout begin to predate on both the bugs and the tadpoles, and predate on the bugs, reducing food availability for the tadpoles and the frogs, right? So then you have a release of predation pressure on the mosquitoes. So mosquito populations go up, every other population goes down after they're introduced. But the effects of the fish aren't just limited to the aquatic habitat, because terrestrial and aquatic habitats are linked through exchanges of energy. So you can think of leaves falling in a stream and then being eaten by aquatic insects, or you can think of aquatic insects emerging out in their adult form and flying around and being prey to spiders, riparian spiders, or things like that. So what happens in one can affect the other, and that's the case here. So obviously these are pictures of the same lake, but let's pretend one is fishless and one has non-native brook trout in them. And so we're going to create another food web really quick using the mayfly, which is an aquatic insect. So it's biphasic. So half of its life, it's a larva. It lives in the streams or lakes. Then as an adult, it emerges out and it flies around, and it can be prey to spiders, birds, bats, all sorts of things. So we're going to create a food web with the mayfly, the gray-crowned rosy finch, and then these non-native brook trout. So you don't have to do it on paper, but maybe just in your mind, think like an ecologist for a second and hypothesize, how could the fish influence this food web with these three actors? So just take a minute, a couple minutes, because
What do you think? They're very high altitude.
Okay, what do we think? Or guess? Yes.
Well, I guess the trout would eat all the mayflies while they're still larvae in the lake, and then the fish wouldn't have enough to eat.
Oh my goodness, you've read this paper before, huh?
Wow.
Yes. So the mayflies, when they're aquatic, they're available to the trout. So by introducing the trout, they suppress the population of mayflies. Therefore, there's less nymphs that can make it to that adult stage and become available for the rosy finches. And so this has been shown to have a negative effect, obviously, but introduced fish can reduce mayflies by 98%. And also the adults are available to the fish. I don't know if you've ever been on a lake in the evening. You see the fish eating on the surface. So the fish are direct competitors with birds, which kind of seems counterintuitive. Yes, and 6 times as many rosy finches in lakes without introduced fish. So the fact that the fish have been introduced so widespread is a big problem for both the native frogs and the native birds. And so large efforts to reduce the abundance and attempts to eradicate or completely remove fishes is occurring in all throughout the high Sierras. And I don't know who Roland is, but he's out there. And you can imagine that you would have to hike. I mean, these are high altitude lakes, right? You would have to carry all your equipment out there. Typically, the best way to suppress fish populations are through gill nets. So you deploy large nets in the that are sort of in the middle of the water column. And when the fish go to swim through them, because they really can't see them, they think they can squeeze through, their operculum, or that gill plate, gets caught in the net, and they try to back out, and they get caught. And so it's a lethal sampling method. But there's large efforts to attempt to eradicate all these non-native fish after there was large efforts by us to try to put them there to begin with. Yes?
Just review, why did we dump so many fish out of airplanes? Like, was it just like for fish?
Yes, probably. And I was backpacked into a mountain lake in Colorado, and there was brook trout like crazy. And I looked into why there was brook trout in there, and apparently miners had taken them up and put them in the lake so that they could fish for them, so they could stay up and do their, resource extraction for longer periods of time. But also a lot of stuff has been done just for sport. People weren't going to these lakes, and we could increase the amount of recreation that was available if they just had some really cool, obscure fish in there, right? So there's probably a lot of reasons, yes.
Just to add to that, this is not to defend people back in the day, but none of this was done with malice. No one was coming into the mountains saying, "Ha, wipe out the natives, here, eat some brook trout," right? Something like that. But it's a case of the value of natural history and biology here, right? People didn't know any better. What they were seeing was this lake, maybe devoid of fish, and say, "Hey, this lake doesn't have fish. If it had fish, we would have something delicious to eat." So they're doing something without the knowledge of the impact it'll have on the system as a whole, and now there are negative consequences that we know about now.
Right. And there wasn't as much knowledge of, these cascading effects that could occur. Yes?
Is the gill netting typically in non-native lakes of the definition, or is it the combination of
So gill netting is a sampling method that is used pretty widely. People would often use gill nets just for fishing, right? When salmon were so abundant that you'd wear your arm out like pulling them in, you would just put a gill net in and haul them all in at once. But these efforts that I'm referring to are specifically to remove non-native fish from alpine lakes. Other questions? Yes?
Is that all possible to do like
Well, yes, it's probably possible, but you would be in a rowboat to do it, like an inflatable rowboat, because you would have to hike up there, right? And that's the thing with the gill nets, is that they're passive. The fish swim into them. So, and I've seen gill nets. They're pretty efficient at removing fish. If it's a net as long as this room, it can be stuffed full of fish. Just stuffed full of them. The problem that happens, right? So why aren't they all gone? If there's people like Roland here out there, trying to restore these ecosystems back to the way they were, it's incredibly difficult to eradicate, particularly brook trout for some reason. There's actually been some research done where they're trying to do Trojan males, and they make a male that will produce sperm that only has Y chromosomes, with the hope that stocking them in there will eventually only males will be in that population, and they'll eventually die off. Now, of course, if you've seen Jurassic Park, nature finds a way, right? And it's always more complicated than you think it's going to be. But where I went to graduate school in Idaho, these efforts, because there, of course, brook trout are having horrible effects on the native fishes in Idaho as well. So there's pretty extensive efforts to try to figure out how to remove these non-native fishes. Yes?
I had a quick question. In your map of the historic abundance and distribution of these fishes, what information do we have that tells us which of these lakes did not have fishes historically? How do we get that info? So we can say there weren't fishes there a while back.
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess just through assessment, there would be, if there were fish there, they would be native fish, right? There would be fish that were found elsewhere in the Central Valley or in the Eastern Sierras. But also historical stocking records are available in a lot of these, because these efforts, the Fish and Game Fish and Wildlife, CDFW, presumably kept records, right? And not in all cases, but in most cases kept records of the number of fish they stocked, so they would know when they needed to put more in, right? But there are extensive stocking records available. Other questions? Okay, I'm going to go over Chinook salmon in the Central Valley very quickly. So in the Central Valley, there are 4 different types of Chinook salmon. And remember, we talked about anadromous fishes. Also, steelhead are an anadromous fish that's kind of lumped in with salmon. A steelhead is a rainbow trout that becomes anadromous. These different spring, fall, late fall, and winter labels for these populations are when the fish come back into freshwater. So the fish are born in freshwater, they go to the ocean. Spring fish come back into freshwater in the spring, fall in the fall, and so on. And the Central Valley used to be a Chinook salmon superhighway. So the picture on the left is a simulated image of California before all the water began to be diverted, abstracted, sent, to the southern part of the state. Agriculture uses a lot of water. So you can see there's pretty dramatic the difference in how much water there would have been versus how much water there is now. And additionally, the slide can be a little wonky. Additionally, we've dammed a lot of the waters here in California. So here's Sacramento and here's Fresno. So this is the whole Central Valley. As this map slowly populates, you'll be able to see all the dams and when they were installed. And so these dams do not have fish passage on them, so it completely reduces habitat availability for migratory fishes. And for fishes like Chinook salmon, particularly winter-run Chinook salmon that rely on very cold spring-fed water for their eggs to rear in, this loss of habitat has been detrimental. And they've almost gone extinct. Yes, it keeps going. It gets worse and worse, and there it is. So, even though we had all this water in California, now a lot of it is dammed, and the connectivity between the system is extremely limited. So the winter run Chinook salmon was also a high elevation fish found primarily in the McCloud River, which is a spring-fed river. They were found in the McCloud River because they require extremely cold spring-fed water for their eggs to rear. However, in the 1940s, Shasta Dam and Keswick Dam were built, and that cut off 100% of their spawning habitat. So they would have spawned in this upper right-hand corner, kind of northeast of Redding, and so they lost all of their spawning habitat. So historically, winter run Chinook would have comprised about 200,000 individuals returning from the ocean. In 2015, there was 3,500 individuals, and you can see that they've almost gone extinct a couple times. Next to no returns after the dams were put in. Well, the dams were put in the 40s, so I imagine prior to the 40s, there was even larger numbers of Chinook salmon. So now they had that, if you remember the map, they had that whole basin that was habitat for them to spawn in. Now the only habitat they have is below this dam right here. So their populations are also critically threatened. And we like to engineer our way into problems and then try to engineer our way out of problems. So because these Chinook salmon are highly valued for commercial fisheries, recreational fisheries, economically and socially, the management of Shasta Dam has shifted to release water from below the dam. So cold water is more dense than warm water, so it sinks down. So by releasing water from low in the dam, it provides cool water downstream. But historically, the Sacramento River wouldn't have been cool. It would have been warm water. That's why the fish were making that long migration all the way into the upper reaches to find cold water. So they installed a temperature control device, and it's had detrimental impacts on other native fishes because things like sturgeon and some of the different non-game fishes in the Sacramento River sucker, tui perch, things like that, were relied on that warm water. So to attempt to restore winter run Chinook, they've been reintroduced into new habitats, trap and haul methods. So you trap the fish below the dam, put it in the back of a car, and you drive it up around the dam, and you release it, and then it has offspring, and then you catch them, and then you drive them around the dam and release them again, right? So, since we're running out of time, I'll just leave it there. Conservation hatcheries are also a big thing. Basically, it's just creating fish not for sport or for commercial fishing, but just simply to restore populations. So here's a fish waiting to get its ride to the ocean. Thank you all.